Hello explorers, thanks for joining us again and welcome back to another exciting and informative video on our YouTube channel. If you are joining us for the first time, I want to thank you for watching. In this episode, I will be looking into the reason why the United States of America is scrambling its officials into the continent of Africa like military jets. I will be looking at the reason why the US administration is waking up from its slumber as the current geopolitical events in the continent of Africa continue to unfold, as African nations are poised to make strategic choices to also leverage their importance not just in the region but in geopolitical aspects around the world. If you look at geopolitics in play, Kenyan President Dr. William Ruto is the first African leader in more than 15 years to make an official state visit to the United States of America. That goes a long way to tell you with regards to how the United States of America perceive the sub-Saharan African continent countries. If you look at other areas, the high-level visit has not been a regular component of the United States of America's relationship with the continent of Africa. In previous United States administration, visits by executive branch officials were dangled as a reward to well-behaved African governments, while United States of America's officials have gone to a great length to avoid comparing their presence in Africa with their geopolitical rival China. Their comparison is instructive. For 33 years, Chinese foreign ministers have made Africa the first stop of their annual overseas travel. This policy has become standard and part of the normal order of business, so much so that it gets no special media coverage. The remains is seemingly immutable, not to coax the United States of America into engaging with Africa, more so than with any other region. Seeing no strategic interest in Africa, US policies largely engage the continent through a prism of perceived risk and problems. Material and also American presence has thus historically been through Department of Defense deployment and security partnership and aid programs like PEPFAR, the President's Malaria Initiative, and the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Commercially, the American presence in the continent of Africa has been geographically concentrated in South Africa and in extractive elsewhere on the continent. When US officials did visit Africa, they never failed to lecture their host on perceived evils, especially corruption. So prevalent were the corruption lectures that Africa, more than any other regions in the world, becomes synonymous with corruption. This hasn't sit well with the continent of African officials, as the former chairperson of the African Union lashed out the United States perspective, comparing the United States of America's approach alongside that of China. Let's listen to what he has to say and we will jump into more specifics in this video.
The good thing with China is that China has decided to share. China is still a developing country, but it's decided to share the prosperity that they are gaining with the rest of the world. And we have seen it being done, whether it is in the framework of Belt and Road Initiative, and whether it is also in some of the initiatives that China started. For instance, the Global Development Initiative, yes, the Global Civilization Initiative. The Chinese model was prefixed on its own culture. And I think this is the very basis of what President Xi Jinping is saying under the Global Civilization Initiative. Let us be inclusive of all global cultures, no hegemonic preference of any culture. Let us come to the table recognizing our differences and recognize that we become stronger by recognizing our diversity. Africa has always been talking about, say, in the realm of peace and security, African solutions to African problems. And so that is a question that we use our own cultures of how we solve some of our problems. And we have seen when we use a mixed bag, the kind of results we have seen. Take the case of Libya and the rest. But also when it comes to issues of democracy, we can see that democracy, which was seen as a value that was sold by the West, needs to be adapted to the cultures of culture. Not to say that we ignore the values of of democracy, but it must be adapted. It cannot be implemented wholesale as it is in the West.
As the United States of America continue to find its feet with regards to the continent of Africa, African countries are making some very strategic choices. The US is trying to counter its geopolitical foes like China and also Russia in several ways. Most recently, the United States of America, in terms of March of 2023, Secretary of Education Miguel Cardona led the United States of America's delegation to the Democratic Summit in Zambia, becoming the 6th high-level US official to visit to the continent of Africa that particular year. His visit came on the heels of Vice President Kamala Harris' visit, which itself followed a visit by First Lady Jill Biden. The United States Ambassador to the United Nations and Secretaries of State and also Treasury have all already visited the continent of Africa. If you look at perspective, these high-level ranking White House officials have indicated that agencies and departments receive guidance to organize substantive engagement with the continent of Africa, including visits from their various heads for the first time in a very long time. The US government, bureaucracy and also instructions to expand its engagement with the African continent is being rolled out. This has raised questions, especially in the continent of Africa, on whether those changes marked an inflection point in the also relationship between the United States of America and its African partners. If you look at the geopolitics in play, this flurry of visit draw attention because it's a historically unexpected and unusual to see that number of experts traveling to the continent of Africa. But the question here is, by just sending officials to the continent of Africa and not making huge infrastructural development and engaging the continent in terms of growth and making sure that money and infrastructural development can be seen by the continent of African people, that's not working and also holding grounds in the region. Let's listen to what these experts have to say with regards to the comparison in China, in the continent of Africa, and we will dive into the analysis further in this video.
The list of Chinese infrastructural projects that have been unfolding in Africa over the past 20 years, when you compare them to what Western countries have brought, and I mean specifically infrastructural projects, factories, railroads, stuff like that, there really is no comparison. The United States and France were working on a security paradigm. They were building bases and providing security, anti-terrorism measures, and an absolute minimum economic investment came along with that. The Chinese are doing something different, and the Russians are also moving in both with security assistance and economically. So economically, the long-term benefits seem better on the Sino-Russian side than they have been on the Western side. Now, how long this will last is an open question, but the West has had its chance, and the Africans have turned elsewhere. It is ultimately Africa's decision, and I understand how, for many Africans, the anti-colonial narrative resonates with the history of the 20th century, when it was the socialist camp that supported the anti-colonial struggle across the entire continent, from the north in the heady days of Nasser and the Algerian struggle against the French, all the way down to Angola and to South Africa. So let's see what happens. But it looks like this, what we're seeing in the Sahel today is really part of a much broader de-Westernization phenomenon, which is sweeping our planet and doesn't seem to me to show any signs of slowing down. Quite the contrary, it seems to be picking up.
As the continent of Africa continues to make very important choices in the current geopolitical sphere, what we all see in West Africa, specifically in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and also what happened in Gabon, as France has been kicked out in the continent of Africa, the European Union is nowhere to be found, and more importantly, the United States is still holding its grounds in the continent of Africa. If you look back to the 1962, according to Rupert Emerson, who described the United States of America's African relations in terms that are still relevant today. If you look at geopolitics, the United States, according to Emerson, who said, the United States of America is far freer from commitment in Africa, south of the Sahara, than in any other regions of the world. Everywhere else, African policy operatives in the setting of old established friendships and understandings, alliances such as those creating NATO and CENTO and CETO in Africa to unprecedented degree. The United States of America is not bound by established positions or traditions, by fixed agreements or vested interests. The lack of institutionalization of the United States of America's engagement in Africa places the relationship disproportionately at the whim of whoever is currently occupant of the White House. The United States of America's African relations can thus go from a president who openly mused about shutting down every African embassy on the continent of Africa to one who hosts over 50 African presidents and prime ministers at an official summit. That summit itself, however, came after an 8 years hiatus, and also neither side knows if any such gathering will occur again in the United States of America. If you look at perspective, despite the fact that the United States of America has invited the Kenyan president for an official visit, this goes a long way to demonstrate the difference with regards to the narrative that China is in the continent of Africa for just natural resources or materials. However, if you look at Chinese investment and commitment in the continent of Africa, it goes a long way to demonstrate and debunk a lot of other areas. African people would prefer to have a route that brings natural crops from the farm to the market. This is what the African people want to see, and this is what the African people want to know that their geopolitical partners engaging their governments are focused on. Let's listen to what this particular analyst will say, and then we close down this video.
And for more on Africa's trading industry, we now bring in Jude Moore. He's a senior policy fellow at the Center for Global Development. Jude, thanks so much for joining us. I want to start by asking you, how have economic and trade ties between China and Africa strengthened in recent years? And where are the sectors for mutual cooperation? For example, Chinese imports of commodities like crude oil and copper have largely driven up trade.
Thanks again for having me. It's a pleasure being here, Karina. I think first, as your reporter noted, for the last, since 2009, China has been the continent's largest trade partner. But in the beginning of that relationship, it was predominantly commodities, right? I mean, minerals, crude oil, but that's changed, especially in 2021 at the China-Africa Forum, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. China then pledged to import up to $300 billion worth of African products. And one of the ways to do that was to establish these green lanes that allow African agricultural products to come into the Chinese market. And that changed. So the relationship between China and Africa has evolved over time, and we're entering a different period now.
And just how much Chinese investment is there in Africa? By that I mean, which countries there are the biggest recipients of Chinese goods and funds? And then how beneficial is a strong alliance between the two regions?
Well, first you have to understand that outside of the EU 27, China is the continent's largest trade partner in everything, right? It's Chinese consumer goods, but in African minerals. But so some of the countries that are really dominant in the relationship, of course, would be Angola. Part of that is because of the crude oil. And then we have South Africa. South Africa is one of the most significant trade partners. Kenya is also an important trade partner. But because of these green lanes, you're beginning to see an expansion. So, for example, the expo is being held in Hunan province. And Hunan has basically tried to establish itself as the hub for Africa trade, right? So it was one of the first provinces to introduce the green lanes, making it easier for African agricultural products to enter China. So we've seen a 16 times increase in African products entering China on year between last year and this year. Mainly, we're talking chilies from Rwanda, we're talking tea and avocados from Kenya, we're talking natural rubber. So there is now an expansion so that it's not just a few countries that are benefiting from the relationship, but a whole range of different African countries.
And Jude, what are some of the biggest challenges in your mind, both short-term and long-term, to expanding trade opportunities between both regions? Africa has a huge amount of debt issues, for one thing.
I think generally what comes up is infrastructure, right? And so there's this the difficulty of moving from one African country, especially land and road transport infrastructure. But you will also note that over the last 20 years, a significant portion of Chinese investment on the continent, Chinese lending to the continent, has gone to infrastructure. So infrastructure remains an issue. The second thing is, as one of the interviewees noted, you have 54 different countries, 54 separate policies, 54 separate rules. And so sometimes it's difficult to scale. And that's a difficulty for Chinese firms looking to do business on the continent. But because of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, you're seeing the continent moving toward a point where some of those things can be taken care of. But this is an important thing, because China's relationship with Africa is so multifaceted. It's in infrastructure, where the continent has weaknesses in infrastructure. It is expanding access to the Chinese market for African products in agricultural products. So we're seeing the relationship evolve, but in a positive way.
We want to thank you for watching. Hopefully we've informed you with regards to the importance and the reason why the continent of Africa is poised to make strategic choices in its own future, and why the United States of America still struggle at this particular time. Hopefully the current visit in the United States of America by the Kenyan president will also elevate the US presence, and also make sure that the United States of America understand that Africa need infrastructure and also development, not just democracy and also geopolitics. We want to thank you. We are looking forward to meeting you soon. If you are new to this channel, check some of our previous videos to enhance your geopolitical knowledge in the continent of Africa. We want to thank you for watching. We see you soon in our next episode. Have a good day. Bye-bye.